different DOM methods available in JavaScript to manipulate the HTML. And broadly, we can classify that the HTML manipulation happens in four phases. So you can either create elements, you can add elements, you can replace existing elements, as well as you can remove existing elements in the DOM. And in this video, we will be see all of the important vanilla JavaScript methods or the conventional JavaScript methods to manipulate the HTML elements directly. So let us get started with iDigitalpreneur. Now, the first thing that we're going to see is how you can use the DOM methods available in the JavaScript specification to create elements dynamically. So we already have seen an example in one of the previous videos, but we will reiterate over it. So let us say that there is a UL element inside of my HTML, and I have my button which says generate new item, right? And on the click of this button, basically I want to add in all of these list elements inside of my UL, and I don't need to write any HTML for it. I will be controlling all of that using JavaScript. So that is the entire point of making your entire website or your web pages interactive, because on a certain event that is occurring, that is on the click of a button, you want something to happen in the DOM which kind of changes the visual representation of the entire web page. In our case, we just want to add in more HTML elements so that those HTML elements are visible in the final output being shown to the user, right? So I have created my HTML, and on the click of this button, I will basically keep on adding some list items inside of this UL. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to call these two HTML elements inside of my JavaScript. So I'm going to say const list, and this is going to be a document.query selector. You can choose to use any other DOM selectors which we have already discussed. Query selector kind of makes it easier for me to visualize different selectors available in HTML, and I can even nest together CSS combinators to kind of make my targeting process much more easier. So I'll be going ahead with the query selector, and the element which I want to target is actually an UL element. And I'm also going to say the button, which is again document dot query selector, right? And the element which I'm targeting is actually a button. Now I will go ahead to the next step, which is to kind of add an event listener to the element which will trigger the event. And on the triggering of that event, I will be running a callback function. We already saw this process in the previous video where we discussed about attaching event listeners to all of these HTML elements. So taking the button reference, I will say button.add event listener. This is an inbuilt method which is available in the JavaScript specification, which essentially takes in two arguments. It first of all takes in the type of event that will occur from this particular HTML node into consideration. So the event which I want to occur is called a click. So I will say click, and make sure that the event name is actually inside a pair of single quotes or double quotes, because if you just give it click, this essentially makes JavaScript think that you're trying to reference a variable by the name of click, which is of course not the case here. So I will do click, and the next argument separated by a comma is an anonymous callback function, or you can write a normal function and pass that definition inside of this add event listener method. But just to make things simple, I will probably pass in the callback function anonymously, and I will be using an arrow function. Now, it is highly imperative that you use an arrow function and not a conventional function for passing any event listeners, any callbacks to the event listeners, owing to the fact that how arrow functions and the normal functions behave, right? Normal functions will have a binding issue. That means that function will not get binded to the current HTML element into consideration, but that is simply not the case with an arrow function. And to kind of discuss more about this, again, this is beyond the scope of our discussion, yet I will link some resources where you can study more about the binding context of all of these HTML elements. Now, the next thing that we can take a look at is that we have passed in the callback function, and I just want to pass in different things that I can do once the event has occurred. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create an HTML element, and I'm going to say const, let's say the variable name is li, or I could say list item. is equal to, and then I'm going to do document dot create element. Now create an element essentially takes in the name of the HTML tag that you want to create. So in my case, I want to create an li, and again make sure that the name of the HTML tags are actually inside a pair of quotes, because if you just pass in without a quote, it will think that there is a variable name by the name of li, right? So we have created the HTML element, but again, if I click on this button right now, you will see that nothing happens because I am only creating the element, but I haven't actually taken that element and attached it to the HTML DOM. So to do that, what I can do is I will go ahead and I will say that the list, because I need to append this list item as a child of this list. That means I want to append this li as a child inside of my UL. So I will take the reference of my list and I will say list dot append child. Now append child is again an inbuilt DOM manipulation method in JavaScript, which kind of appends a single DOM node or a single HTML node inside of another HTML element. So in this case, I want my li to be inside of my UL, and I have a reference for my UL as a list, which you can already see, and I can simply go and say list item. Now even if I run this right now, I will see that empty list items are getting added because I created the HTML element. I attached it as a child to my UL element, but there is no content inside of my li elements. To insert a content, we have another of these JavaScript methods, and one of them is known as li dot text content. Now text content or text content or inner text are basically the same thing, but there are some subtle differences between the two. Whenever you want to insert some content or text content, simply just a text content, you use the text content. But when you are doing inner text, that is basically a little bit unsafe, if I would like to say it. So let's just do inner text first, and then we'll see what the differences are when it comes to text content. So I will say li.inner text, and this needs to be a value inside of a string because now I'm inserting some elements or inserting a text inside of my list. So I will say this is a dynamic list item, full stop. And now once I run this, then we'll see that there is some error. So I will see what the error is. It says li is not defined. That is because this is not li, this is actually list item, right? And now let's run this and see whether we are getting it. And now on the click of the button, I can see that all of these li elements are getting added inside of my UL. Now, just to prove that these elements are actually getting inserted inside of my UL element, I will go here and inspect the DOM element, and let me hover over this. And now you can see that inside of my UL, I have all of these list elements created, and the text content of these list elements is the text which I added inside of my inner text. Now let's try to replace inner text with text content and see if something changes. So I will do text content list item dot, this is text content, right? And now let's generate a new item and see if this works. So this also works because text content and inner text are kind of the same thing. Inner text basically was used in the older specifications of the JavaScript. Text content is rather a new one. And there were also some security issues with inner text in comparison to text content. So this is how you create element and insert some content inside of it. Now let us say that you wanted to insert HTML element inside of my li. So there is yet another method which is available, and this is again not a very safe method to use, but it's just available in the specification for us to use, and it is called inner HTML. Now inner HTML basically takes in a string in which I can create or construct a HTML string sequence which is needed to be added inside of my li. So let's say inside of my li, I want to create a sequence of span and then some text inside of it, right? So I can simply say something like this, inner HTML, and here I will construct the sequencing. I will say this is inside of a span, right? And then I will close in the span. So I will basically construct the HTML element as a string, but instead of using inner text or text content, now I'm using inner HTML, because the way the browser is going to parse this inner HTML is that it will find out the HTML elements and it will parse the entire string content as HTML DOM nodes. Now, if I keep on doing this, you will see that visually it's the same that we were getting with text content and list item. But if I go ahead and inspect it inside of my li, I will see that now my HTML element of span is available, and this is no longer just a text but a text inside a pair of span. So inner HTML is a great way when you want to inject some HTML, some dynamic HTML inside of another HTML. But inner HTML creates more problems, because now the any malicious person has the advantage of basically adding some malicious JavaScript or HTML code, which will kind of break the entire flow of your application. And that is why you need to be really, really sure about using inner HTML. There are, of course, some middleware available, and there are some libraries which kind of cleanses the HTML of any malicious code before being injected into the DOM. But that is well beyond the scope of our discussion today. So whenever you want to add in content, the best thing that you can do is use text content or inner HTML. So this was all about creating HTML elements and adding HTML elements. Now let us look at different ways in which we can replace existing HTML elements, and we will be seeing two ways of doing it. The one is replace with method, which kind of replaces the current element with another element. And we have something called replace child, which is used to replace certain child elements present inside of a specific parent. So what I'm going to do is, let's say I have created an h2 and I say this is a h2, right? And I have created a button which says replace h2 with h3. Now what I want is, on the click of this button, I want to replace this h2 with an h3, and the text content also needs to change. So inside of my JavaScript, what I'm going to do is, I am going to first of all call these two HTML elements into consideration. So I will say heading 2 is nothing but the document.query selector, and the element which I'm calling in is for h2, and I also need to have a reference for my button. So I'm going to say document.query selector of my button, right? And now I want to attach an event listener, so I will say button.add event listener. And the type of event which I want this button to be triggering is the click event. So I'll say click, and I need to execute a callback function for this on the click of this button. Now what I want is, I want to replace h2 with h3. So I'll first of all using the replace with method. So I will take the current context of the element which I want to be replaced, and I'll be calling the replace with method. And now I need to pass in the reference of the element which I want to be replaced. But before we do that, before we pass in the DOM reference of that particular HTML element, I will first of all go ahead and create it. So I will say, let's say heading 3 is nothing but, I'm first of all creating the element, and I'm creating an h3 here, and I'm also putting in some text content, and I'm putting this is a h3, right? And now I will take this, and let's replace this with heading 3. So now I'll take this DOM reference node of h3, and I will pass it inside of my replace with method. Now the moment I click on this button, I can see that there are some issues here. So I will see what the issue is, which says button is not defined. That is because I have used btn as a reference. So I will use btn here, right? And now let's check whether our code is working. So once I click on the button, this h2 was actually replaced by h3, and the inner text content was also changed. So you're seeing how we can use specific steps. So everything in JavaScript, everything in HTML rather, can be manipulated with JavaScript, starting from the type of HTML element to the content of the HTML element. And this is what replace with method does. Now let's look at another example which uses the replace child method. So for this example, I will first of all create some basic HTML. So there is a div and there is a span with, let's say, an ID of child span, right? And here I'm saying hello world, right? I'm saying hello world. Now what I want to do is I want to replace on the click of a button. Let's say I created a button and it says replace child, right? And what I want to do is on the click of this button, I want to replace this span with something else which I have created. And this span is actually a child element of this div. Now, how to do this is, first of all, I will have all of the references with me. So I have my button reference, which is working fine. And let's remove all of this because we don't require it anymore, right? And now I will basically start creating my logic inside of my callback function. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new element reference. And to do that, I will be using the create element method. So I will say span2, which is essentially equal to document dot create element. And the type of element which I want to create is essentially a span, right? I want this span to be replaced by some another span. And I also want to give this new span an ID. So I can use the dot ID method pretty much the same way I can use a dot class method to assign a new class to any of my HTML elements dynamically via JavaScript. So instead that I will be using dot ID, and let's give this ID of new span, right? Now I will also go ahead and say that the text content of this span, so I'll use span2 dot text content, and I am going to be saying that this is replacement of old span, right? Because I want this particular span to be replaced with the original span that is present inside of my div, right? And now what I will do is I will basically go ahead and I will call up this particular HTML element, because how the replace child basically works is that you need to have a reference of the parent as well. Now there are two ways of doing it. Either you can call up the reference of this particular parent node, right, directly, because you know that this is in fact the parent of this span. But there is another way when you don't know the parent of something, right, and you want to take a reference of the parent from the child node itself. So what you can do is you can simply create a parent reference. So I'm going to say const parent node, right? And this parent node is essentially nothing but the parent of my, it's the parent of my span2, right? Because that is what I want to create, right? And the new essence here is that this span2, because this span2 is getting created first. So what I want to do is I want to first of all get this span here, because I want to have the uh, parent element of this span rather than span2. So this is a mistake. I don't need the parent node like this. But before I do that, I will first of all have a reference of my span here. So I will say, let's say I call this span1, and I will say document dot, because I used an ID here, so I can use get element by ID. And the element which I'm looking out for is child span, right? Child span. Now basically this span1 will have a reference of this span, and using the reference of this span I can have a reference to my parent. Like this, I can say span1 dot parent node, right? Dot parent node is an inbuilt method, and I can store this inside of my variable called parent, right? Const parent is basically parent node, right? And now finally, because I have the reference of my parent here, I can go ahead and call that replace child method. So I will say parent dot replace child, and the replace child method basically takes in two arguments. It first of all takes in the new element that you want it to be replaced, and then separated by a comma, it takes in the reference of the old element that was already there. So I will first of all say that this is basically span 2, which is something which I want it to be replaced with. And the thing which I'm replacing is span 1, right? And now once I click on this button, right? Once I click on this button, I will again see what the issue is. It says BTN is has already been declared, right? So let's remove this cons. I think that was an error here. And let's just say that the button is there, right? And now let's go ahead and check this if this works. And now you can see that my old span of hello world has been replaced by a new span with the inner text content of replacement of old span. So basically, replace child only works with the context of a parent HTML node. And when you want to simply replace an existing HTML element which you already know you have a reference of with another of the HTML element that you have created, instead of using replace child, you can simply use replace with. And that is all there is to replacing HTML elements using the DOM methods. Now let's look at different ways in which we can remove child elements or remove HTML elements. And we already saw how we could create elements, append or add new elements to the DOM flow, replace existing elements. And now it's time to basically see how we can remove child elements or HTML elements. So essentially there are two ways with which we could remove HTML elements from the DOM. The first one being the remove method and the other one being the remove child method. So here I have a button which says delete element, and I have a paragraph here, and on the click of this particular button I want this paragraph to be removed. And inside of my JavaScript, I'm simply calling in the reference for both of these HTML elements, and I have attached an event listener with the click event. And inside of my callback function, now I can write the remove logic. So here, because I have the reference of my paragraph HTML element, and that is what the remove method is used in for, you simply take in the reference of para and you call the remove method like this. So the remove method basically takes in the current element which gets removed or wants to be removed, and we don't pass in any reference inside of this method whatsoever. So now if I click on delete element, you will see that my paragraph is completely removed from the DOM flow. And it is not that it is visually hidden only. If you take a look at, or if you inspect the DevTools and you take a look at the HTML which is getting rendered, inside of my body, I can only see the button HTML tag and no paragraph tag, because not only does it visually remove something, it removes the entire reference of that HTML node from the DOM tree. And that is exactly what the remove method does. Now, if we want to remove certain child elements, we can use the remove child method as well. And for this purpose, I'm going to change up the HTML a little bit. So let's create a div with a ID of top, right? And inside of this div, let's create a paragraph, right? Let's create a paragraph. So I'm going to say para, and I'm going to give it a ID of, let's say, nested, right? Now what I want to do is, because this paragraph is the child of this particular div, I want to only remove the child, right? So I can have a certain bit of references here. And this is the same thing what we did with replace child elements, that we need to have the parent reference in place in order to remove a child element. So here I will change up my JavaScript a little bit. So I will say const of parent is nothing but document dot, and I'm going to use a get element by ID here, get element by ID, and this is essentially the top. And I also need to have a reference of the paragraph inside of it. So I will say const child, and I will say document dot get element by ID, and the ID which I'm looking out for is nested, right? Is nested. And now I can go ahead and have a reference over it. So let's also take in a button which says delete para inside of div, inside div, right? And now I will attach an event listener, but before that I need to call up that inside of my JavaScript. So I will say document dot query selector, and I'm calling in the button, right? And here I will say button dot add event listener, listener, and I'm talking about the click event. and there needs to be a callback function. Inside of this callback function, right, the point where we can have different scenarios. If there is a point where you already know the parent of the child or the parent of the HTML element which you want to be removed, you can take in the reference of both of them, and you can simply say parent dot remove child, and the remove child method basically takes in the reference of the child element which you want to remove inside of that parent, because the remove child method is being called in the context of the parent. So now I need to specify exactly which child of this parent do I want to be removed, and because I know the child element by reference, I can simply say child like this. And now let's add in some text here because that was not visible at all, right? So here I will say lorem 40, auto generate some paragraphs. So I realized that the get elements by ID, I had a capital N here. That is why I was not getting the reference of my child element. So let's make this back to nested. And now once I click on this button, let me close this, click on this button, and now you will see that the paragraph is removed, and it has removed, but the parent will still be there, right? If I go into my HTML, my body, you can see that my div of my ID top is still there, but the child element, that specific child element, has been deleted. Now, this is the scenario when you know about the parent HTML tag. In case you don't have a reference of the parent node, you can simply do it something like this, right? Or if you want to kind of use the parent HTML tag without specifying the element which you want to remove, right, you can call in the parent node method and then call the remove child method to remove exactly that child from it. So usually you will have reference of the parents, and you will basically try to have a dynamic references of all of the child elements, but that is how you remove HTML elements from the DOM flow. So just to summarize things, what we have done so far, we created new HTML elements using the create HTML method. Then we use the append and append child methods to kind of append HTML elements inside of the DOM of the flow, right? After we had created it, then we saw how we could replace existing HTML elements with replace with and replace child methods. And finally, we saw how we could use the remove child and remove method to kind of erase the existing HTML elements from the DOM flow. So all of this collectively, with all of the methods we have discussed in JavaScript, you can manipulate the HTML. We already saw how we could manipulate CSS by using the .style object and specifying different styling properties using JavaScript. A combination of all of it, you can now start creating something really complex and a highly interactive website. Again, there will be a lot of limitations owing to the fact that you have to write a lot of JavaScript to achieve a very single bit of functionality, which we already saw that just to delete a particular paragraph, I had to write a lot of code to it. And all of these issues are basically addressed in modern day frameworks like React and Angular and even Vue.js, where all of these manual DOM manipulation tasks are delegated so that you only write the logic for it. We will discuss about React when we start up the next module. But now let's go ahead and start building our project, and I will see you all in the next video.